Yes. All right, guys. Welcome back to another episode of Canadian Beef Podcast. We have a very special guest today, Dr. Dean St Mart, who is a PhD, and he is now on our podcast today to answer our questions. Thank you so much for coming on today, Dr. Dean.
A pleasure. I know you asked me a while back to be on, and obviously it's been a challenge with time zone differences. So it's 8:30 in the evening here. It's probably nice and sunny in the middle of the day over in Canada now.
Absolutely. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy evening to join with us. And we've also
Yeah,
got
no, of course.
BLP, of course, Benoit Lapierre, and we've got Big Mo.
Hey guys.
So, without further ado, Benoit, if you'd like to ask the first
Yes, of
question.
course. Yeah, I have many questions for him. I back many years ago, almost a decade. I was going off for a very long time. Because I was doing like 3 cycle of pretty intense and hardcore, and after like 3 times 8 7 weeks, I felt I was kind of inflamed. I felt like I had to rest, and I was doing a completely full rest. To almost kind of crash my suppression. I did it instinctively. I didn't have any words for it or background of science back then, and uh, and that's what I did. And for me it works. I mean, it wasn't easy per se because there's a period you're kind of at zero. You're kind of at the lowest of the lowest. I was actually keeping decent size even though it was off per se for a long time. And that's where I realized that when you're fully off and you have certain size, that's where you have amateur and professional. I had decent size as a natural off post mini cycle, but not enough to carry a professional size, obviously. And when I saw your YouTube explaining the contradiction between suppression and stimulation and where HCG could be neurotoxic or even inflammatory and create confusion. For me, it makes so much sense. I was completely in awe, of your revelation because you could put exact word. And nowadays, because we have kisspeptin, triptorelin, HMG, it's much easier to kind of, go in an activation mode. So especially that we have such many bodybuilder have challenges with fertility, especially the new generation. So my question, my behalf is more like how did you find this input? Was it your own assumption? Was it the inspiration, or was it a clinical research or your own kind of intellectual journey through science?
It's a very interesting question. I guess I was very lucky when I was doing my PhD in chemistry. I got to know Dr. Michael Scally, who proposed the power PCT. I got to know him really well over Facebook. And the more I thought about it then, in terms of like the power PCT protocol, and a lot of people are going to be shocked, but Dr. Scally actually wrote a article stating he never said anyone was to start PCT after 2 weeks. So this was sort of like how bodybuilding has Chinese whispers of someone puts something out and then it just spirals out of control of everyone following the sort of follow the sheep process. But to me, from like the background of pharmacology and looking how the drug actually worked, to me it made no sense that if you, I guess the easiest example would be equipoise, knowing that the sort of terminal half-life of equipoise is, you know, 10 to 14 days half-life, and you're looking at about maybe 50 to 70 days full drug clearance. And I seen this personally when people were sort of showing their blood work of PCT, where they'd start their PCT 2 weeks after stopping their last shot of equipoise, running the full power PCT protocol that works out at like maybe 10 to 12 weeks between HCG, Clomid, tamoxifen, and then get to the end of it, get their blood work done, and they still have a suppressed HPTA.
Mhm.
And when you sort of dial everything back, they were getting their blood work just as the equipoise was leaving their system. So then you start looking at, well, how do each of the three sort of proposed drugs in that protocol work? HCG is an endogenous peptide in our body, but also we utilize, I guess, as an LH mimic in males. So you're utilizing that to stimulate the Leydig cell to create your own testosterone inside your testicle. But if you've still got androgens in your system feeding back onto the hypothalamus and the kisspeptin system, it's not going to do anything. You're not making gonadotropin releasing hormone. And then the other side of it was Clomid and tamoxifen, selective estrogen receptor modulators blocking the hypothalamus estrogen receptors while also boosting the pituitary's LH output. But again, if there's no gonadotropin releasing hormone being made from the hypothalamus, the pituitary is not making LH and Clomid is doing nothing. So it's just sort of taking the puzzle apart and then looking at, okay, well, when's the best time to implement these drugs, if you're going to be an intelligent pharmacologist. And that's when you have a fully confirmed shutdown HPTA. And I mean, if you get your bloods done 2 weeks after stopping Test E, you've probably still got a decent chunk of testosterone in your system because at that point, you've only gone through 2 half-lives. And the easiest thing when we're looking at drug metabolism is 5 half-lives for nearly 99.9% drug clearance.
Will you consider that counter feedback loop neurotoxic or inflammatory or just confusing the body? What would be the refraction or the projection of it?
So what I personally think, and a lot of people don't really recognize, is estrogen is what actually shuts down the hypothalamus from making gonadotropin releasing hormone. So when you actually start a cycle or you start TRT, it's not actually the exogenous testosterone that's telling the hypothalamus stop making gonadotropin releasing hormone. It's your estrogen level going outside your sort of baseline number of where you genetically evolved. Your aromatization rate stays pretty much consistent with your genetics, but the number moves higher. And if you think about it, it's a very clever way for your brain to tell that your testosterone level has gone too high. It doesn't actually look directly at testosterone and say, okay, well, your serum testosterone has gone too high. It looks at the metabolite and makes the assumption if estrogen has gone too high, therefore aromatization rate is too high. And finally, testosterone must be too high because we've got too much estrogen. And you see how that estrogen feeds back onto the hypothalamus and that kisspeptin system to stop the hypothalamic neurons making gonadotropin releasing hormone.
That's why I always, sorry to cut you off, but that's why I always thought that HCG was not the best option. You will go as far as saying HMG is more protective in terms of excess of estrogen aromatization from LH FSH? Will that make sense?
That was sort of where I went a step beyond the power PCT and recommended the aromatase inhibitor after the HCG use. And that was because when you take HCG, it'll stimulate the Leydig cell, the LH receptor, the Leydig cell, to bring cholesterol inside, and then your mitochondria will make your steroid hormones. But once you make testosterone in your testicle, it can aromatize quite, 20% of that testosterone will aromatize and the rest of it will go into systemic circulation. But if, again, that testosterone level that you're producing in the testicle from the HCG gets aromatized excessively and that estrogen to testosterone ratio goes too high, you'll get a negative feedback in the hypothalamus from the HCG use.
So you wouldn't be a fan of using HCG and a Clomid or Novadex concurrently. You would use those separately.
I use them separately. So the way I came about it was, it's almost like looking at jump starting the battery of a car. You let the drug fully clear out of the body, and what you're doing is, like you're saying now, you're crashing the system, and people will be like, well, it's madness. You can do HCG, start producing testosterone in the testicle. But to me, this HPTA system has evolved over thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
So you let the drug clear out, and then you see what the brain does in response to that sort of zero hormone. Nothing is interfering. You get your bloods done at that sort of 5 or 6 week clearance point. So you see where exactly what your brain is doing with the drug fully removed. For some people, you'll see a positive response, and LH and FSH will actually be produced from the pituitary. So you'll see that the hypothalamus has sensed the drop in hormone level and becomes stimulated to make gonadotropin releasing hormone. At that point, you bring in serums, you bring in the sort of estrogen blocking aspect and block estrogen's effects on your brain. So Clomid, tamoxifen, blocking the estradiol receptor, whilst also telling the pituitary to, the easiest way to explain it is double your LH output. That's effectively what Clomid will do. And the more LH you make, the more cholesterol you can bring into your Leydig cell, and the more testosterone in theory you can make.
So once that drug clears out and you have that drop in testosterone, let's say we've bottomed out, now we're not producing any testosterone, you're still a fan of using HCG over a triptorelin or kisspeptin, or would you use different ones at different times for different people?
So I'm a bit hesitant with triptorelin because of normally it's sort of like a one-shot wonder where you're implementing something that specifically tells the hypothalamic neurons to produce gonadotropin releasing hormone. Similarly with kisspeptin, you're affecting that structure of the brain. Whereas with HCG, you're affecting the testicle to produce your own testosterone. So the LH receptor, the testicle stimulated, you create intratesticular testosterone of your own, and that can go back out into serum, back to the hypothalamus, and basically kickstart the system. If you don't see a response, so let's say what we're looking for when we use HCG is after that sort of power PCT period of 20 days of that 2000 IUs every second day, is to get blood work done after those 20 days and look for a positive brain response. Look for LH and FSH within the blood work and to be in quote unquote normal range. You know, anything above 0.8 to 1 IU of LH or FSH in the blood. That's telling you that the pituitary is making LH and FSH in a relatively normal amount. And then you look at the total testosterone value that's being induced by the HCG to see is it relatively normal. And you know, at that point, then you've effectively jump-started the testicle to kickstart the brain, basically. If you go the route of like triptorelin, kisspeptin, you're going straight at the hypothalamic neuron and telling it, right, pulse out gonadotropin releasing hormone to get the pituitary making LH and FSH. To me, it's a little more unpredictable than actually going to the source of the testicle, giving that the signal in order for that to tell the brain what's going on.
The thing is, usually people that does triptorelin is because they did tren enantate, test enantate, Masteron enantate all together. So they went in the ultimate suppression, you know? So it's kind of a nuclear option for a nuclear practice. Does that make sense, or does it make more sense?
To me, it still governs by waiting for the drugs to clear. So let even the sort of synthetic anabolic steroids clear. Obviously, everyone's biggest risk factor when it comes to anabolic use is either primary hypergonadism, where you scar or fibrose the testicles themselves so that Leydig cells are dysfunctional, or you end up with secondary hypergonadism, where either the hypothalamic neurons are dysfunctional or the pituitary gonadotropes are dysfunctional. I guess for even with synthetic AAS, I'd wait still for the drugs to clear, get that baseline blood work, and see what's going on. To me, the most difficult part of PCT is recovering your brain. And that's both from a gonadotropin perspective, so your LH and FSH, but the other side that I've become quite vocal about over the last sort of 2 to 3 years is the dopaminergic aspect of getting back normal dopamine transmission to your quote unquote normal testosterone level. Mm-hmm. Because your neurons have a threshold voltage. And when you're taking higher levels of androgens, that dopamine threshold voltage increases. And that's why you get that big dopamine drive, especially when you move to more strongly binding androgens like trenbolone, you get that big dopamine increase. But those dopaminergic neurons, the threshold, needs time for it to relax back to a lower voltage in order to get excited again. So if your nerves are looking for a higher voltage in order to get stimulated and they're not receiving that stimulation, that's where people experience sort of that flat mood, low libido, all these sort of mental aspects post PCT, even though their serum blood work is showing normal total testosterone, normal estrogen, FSH, LH, a completely normal HPTA. The brain just hasn't recovered.
So what do you recommend for someone who is struggling with low dopamine levels or that depression post-cycle? Because that's pretty common with bodybuilders for sure.
I mean, 5 or 6 years on from speaking about this, I still don't have like a solution because there is no way of testing without sort of doing, I guess, brain electrography and sort of nerve transmission tests to see where the voltage of your brain is sitting at. So it's sort of like you've got two aspects. You've got a nerve where the threshold is sitting really high, so it's looking for a high stimulation in order to release dopamine. You can either chuck like gasoline onto the fire and give a lot of dopamine precursors, mucopurines, L-dopa, tyrosine, phenylalanine, give the brain all these nutritional cofactors to make more dopamine, but you're only encouraging that nerve threshold to stay higher than where it should be. And then the other side of it is sort of like the whole dopamine detox of avoiding things that are getting your brain excited towards dopamine nerve transmission, which could be anything, to be honest. It could be, we all know the simple things like social media, pornography, silly
Food,
things like that.
yeah.
Food, yeah. Driving your car really fast, taking gambles, risks. It's very hard to sort of tell someone, okay, well, you're not to do anything because we need those dopamine neurons to relax. So it's something that we don't really have enough sort of clinical data to say this is what's happening in terms of like where we can measure that brain response. But it's definitely observable. Everyone sort of felt, even someone going from a blast to a cruise, or the way I prefer it, going from just like a cycle down to TRT, you definitely see that change in brain chemistry where it's just an artifact of what you've done to your brain architecture by having that higher level of androgens. But it does, I guess, in time, in terms of like the plasticity of the brain and the nerve plasticity, it does go back to a normal threshold again, but there's no sort of time limit. And that's where you see a lot of guys relapse, and that they'll use anabolic steroids, they'll do a PCT, they'll recover back to their baseline numbers. So let's say they have their total testosterone, FSH, LH, all from before they used, and it pretty much mirrors post-use. But now their mood is very flat. They have low libido, they have no sexual interest. Then you end up with this sort of scenario of, well, I had better libido, better drive, better ambition when I was taking steroids. And you get guys who will relapse, to speak, and go back on cycle again to get that dopamine response in their brain.
Or just never coming off at all.
Yeah, and it becomes a vicious cycle.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Okay. Do you want to move on to another topic?
So let's say you do a year-long program of rest, which is kind of difficult. So will you advise growth hormone in that long phase? Because if you go someone like here, like Robin, and Morgan, they're quite massive guys. So obviously overly catabolism is kind of a dangerous, even though they do the protein intake and the electrolyte balance and the magnesium for dopamine, the water intake, whatever, the cardio, the exercise to keep the regimen. You will advise HGH because it would be very difficult for someone their size to not go in REM ketosis or like an over catabolic state.
Of course. And I've often said, the only case scenario where I could see like a for and against for like blasting and cruising, where a cruise is a higher super physiological dose, would be a professional who basically it's their job. You have, and again, everyone's job has risks and benefits. That professional has to take that responsible decision of, well, what is the absolute, I guess, minimum effective dose? And in this case, it probably isn't going to be TRT, that I can sustain a relatively higher amount of muscle mass, because obviously it's reliant on androgen receptor occupation, versus doing sort of a classic Kevin Levrone of either coming completely off or going down to a very low TRT, taking time off and then waiting for muscle memory and time to gain back that size. If you're sort of that top elite professional where like Kevin Levrone, you're doing the Olympia once per year and you can dedicate 5 months to gaining back size to get back on stage for one show, maybe. But if you're sort of doing the circuit where you have to compete in maybe 3 or 4 shows, and then you might have a period off in terms of the season before the Olympia at the end of the year, you have to take that responsible decision on what is that minimum effective dose based on blood work parameters, based on, I guess, your baseline strength, your performance in the gym, your recovery, everything else. So it's a little bit different in that aspect, but for sort of like your amateur level competitor who not to sort of disdain it, but who doesn't really have the genetics for IFBB status, who really shouldn't be making sort of blast and cruising decisions, doing a cycle and back to TRT in that instance would serve them better as opposed to cruising on 300 milligrams or 400 or 500, whatever they pick.
That makes sense.
In terms of blood tests, okay, so let's say the E2, okay, let's say the guy is on decent anabolic androgenic cycle, 1.2, 1.5. He want the minimalization of anti-aromatase in terms of if I overdo anti-estrogen, I can bring insulin resistance, even though I'm using insulin in some parameter. So my question is like, where do you self-manage or self-understood the E2 result in terms of systemic equilibrium for, or hormonal homeostasis and to have the maximum, hypertrophic health as possible? Where do you see the E2? How do you self-manage it?
So when we look at an average male's aromatization rate, it's roughly 200 to 1. So for every 200 molecules of testosterone, you make one estradiol. So you can do a calculation where you can effectively work out where your estrogen to testosterone ratio is. Obviously, that's based on your total testosterone value. And if you've got non-aromatizing androgens in play also, that will only further increase that androgen number to estrogen. So normally what I do is a very rough assumption that if we have a total testosterone value for that person based off their testosterone dose. So let's say, for example, 250 milligrams of testosterone enanthate is making a total testosterone level of 45 nanomole, or I think it's like 900 nanograms per deciliter. I'm not roughly too sure off the top of my head, or it could be higher. I'll actually calculate it here so I know exactly, because I don't really deal a lot with nanogram per deciliter. So 45 nmol is actually 1,300 nanograms per deciliter, so it's way off. So if we say that 250 milligrams of testi is creating 1,300 nanograms per deciliter, what I'll do is, and this is a very rough assumption because obviously you've got with testosterone, it can convert to estrogen, it can convert to DHT, and it can be metabolized by the liver. But in order to try and make it a very simple and quick way of gathering some estimation, is basically equating the non-aromatizing androgens in terms of a milligram amount to the total testosterone. So if they're taking 250 milligrams of Primobolan, I'm going to make an assumption that that's another 1,300 nanograms per deciliter on top. So when you're making the androgen to estrogen ratio calculation, rather than just going by the total testosterone value and you're looking at it and going, oh yeah, well that looks good. Let's say it's 350 to 1. So you're
You
not
don't
too
look
far
at
off.
count, you look at the ratio of comparison.
Yeah. So instead of going, okay, well, it's 300 to 1 based on the testosterone, you'd be falsely led by that because you're not even looking at the other non-aromatizing androgens. So now you add in the actual Primobolan's androgen load to that calculation, and now the ratio is actually 600 to 1. And now you're sort of looking at it and saying, well, the average healthy male is making 1 estrogen for every 200. So now you're heading into a very androgen dominant environment at, let's say, 600 to 1. At that point, what decision can you make off that? You look at the bloods, you look at subjective markers, you look at, fluid volume, blood pressure, mood, rate of gain, obviously with IGF-1. And then you're sort of left with, do I need to actually increase the aromatization rate? Is there actually too little estrogen, or do I need to reduce, for example, if the Primobolan is interacting with aromatase and slightly affecting the E2 level, do I actually need to take the Primobolan down and increase the testosterone to compensate? It's like a fine balancing act where there's not, you don't have a defined equation where you go, well, take this, this, and this, and it's going to all balance out.
Yeah.
Wow.
Very cool.
What
Very
do you
cool,
find?
man. Very cool.
Do you ever hear of that approach before? No.
Not doing the ratios. No, not usually. Yeah.
So normally, like even in a PCT setting, that's what I'll use as a guiding factor for if someone needs to use serum therapy. Let's say their testosterone to estrogen ratio is 100 to 1. But we know that they're in a very estrogenic environment, so we should block the brain from estrogen's effects because they're having double the amount of estrogen than a normal person. That ratio, I can't remember the paper where I got it from. Let me pull it up here.
So do you always start with a SERM like Novadex and Clomid as the first line and then move on? If it was not enough, would you then move on to an aromasin, something like that?
In terms of like someone's cycle setup, like if they were looking for estrogen control.
Yeah.
Uh, Again, I go by trying to use something that's more predictable at controlling estrogen, and it's normally going to be the aromatase inhibitor.
Mhm.
And it's generally going to be aromasin because aromasin's pharmacokinetic properties in terms of how the drug works is relatively well understood in males. So we know that 25 milligrams of aromasin is going to lower the aromatization rate by about 70%. And it has that effect for about 3 to 4 days. So its half-life is about 9 hours.
Mhm.
So if you take 25 milligrams of aromasin, you're going to block estrogen aromatization by 70% for about 3 or 4 days.
And are you
And
a
so
fan? Are you a fan of using, for example, higher doses of Masteron or even Primobolan as a way to reduce estrogen on a cycle?
not necessarily, because it's very unpredictable. You're,
Mhm.
you're never going to have the same as an aromatase inhibitor where you say, well,
There
we
you
know,
go,
like I said,
Robin. Remember that one, Robin.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Because I'm not a fan of that
25,
either. I'm an aromasin guy too. Yeah.
like 25 milligrams of aromasin lowers aromatization by 70% for 3 or 4 days. You
Perfect.
put 250 milligrams of Primobolan in, and you are really banking on what's happening is the flexibility of the molecule can fit into the binding pocket of aromatase. It doesn't bind with the iron atom in the aromatase enzyme, but by being inside the binding pocket, it basically blocks the testosterone from getting inside. And then it leaves the binding site basically. So aromatase has what's called its two gatekeepers, and they're two sort of peptides or amino acids that basically dictate what can fit inside the binding pocket of aromatase.
Mm.
Primobolan and Masteron are quite flexible in terms of their A ring, and that's what gets aromatized. So they can actually fit into that binding pocket, block testosterone from going in, and act as a quote unquote aromatase inhibitor. It's more like an aromatase blocker of being a competitive inhibitor, blocking testosterone from accessing the binding site. But it's not predictable. On paper, it can happen, and people do show blood work when they use Primobolan or Masteron that E2 falls, and that's the proposed mechanism. But it's not, you can't control that aromatization rate the same way as knowing how many molecules are in 25 milligrams of aromasin and how much affinity it has for the enzyme. I think, when we look at people who not vilify but go against aromatase inhibitors, for sure, if you take 25 milligrams of aromasin every single day on your cycle, blocking your aromatization rate by 70%, you're going to crash your E2 eventually. And you're going to bring all the side effects of low E2. But if you're quite intelligent and you dose your aromatase inhibitor the day after whatever is sort of your peak dose that you're injecting, because we know it takes 24 hours for that dose to enter circulation, you're catching that peak with the aromatase inhibitor that you've taken. And so you're blocking its conversion. It could be 12.5 milligrams of aromasin, which equals 35 or 30% aromatization blocking. 6.25, you can titrate the dose, but that 25 milligrams blocks it by 70%. You can adjust your dose accordingly.
And would you be able to go over Benoit, would you be able to go over some of the issues with low estrogen, some of these side effects or health concerns that bodybuilders may run into? Because it's pretty well documented with breast cancer patients if they're using letrozole for long periods of time, bone mineral loss, heart issues, things like that.
Yeah, the heart issue is one side of it in terms of, I guess, HDL suppression. So you've also got the fact that androgens are increasing hepatic lipase, which destroys HDL. You have estrogen, which stimulates HDL production. So now you're really affecting the skew of LDL to HDL, which is only one part, obviously, of the cardiovascular disease equation. I mean, when you sort of question how cardiovascular disease forms, oxidative stress of LDL tends to be the main mechanism that we're starting to accept now, that when LDL is damaged by oxidative stress, it triggers foam cell production from your immune system, and those foam cells aggregate into plaque. But obviously, if you've got more LDL particles in circulation as well, and if you've got more ApoB, that's why it's always important to check on blood work ApoB, you're going to see the amount of LDL particles that can have, I guess, interactions with the ApoB receptor to offload their cholesterol. And if that's into your cells to repair them, great. If those ApoB receptors are on arteries, you're dumping cholesterol into the artery. So when you sort of look at crash D2, the other side of it could be dopamine nerve toxicity, because there's a very intricate balance between how estrogen and androgens influence your neuron transmission between your serotonin and your dopamine. You need, I guess it's sort of a paradox. Testosterone will increase your dopamine output, but estrogen will make your nerve more sensitive to dopamine transmission. So that's where you sort of need this healthy balance of having a relatively good E2 level in order to have healthy libido, because it's linked to your dopamine level of your brain. And that's sort of where the other issues then stem. That if you allow your E2 to go excessively too high, you're going to end up with serotonergic issues, where you're going to have that as the primary neurotransmitter, and it sort of dampens then your libido, where it's sort of like this Goldilocks of you need to get it just right in order to have healthy libido, in order for your dopamine to shine through, and not excessive serotonin that you feel real lazy and sort of happy and content, but you've just got no drive. They're the two sort of main ones when you're trying to balance E2, is the brain chemistry and heart health in males.
And bone
And
density
obviously,
because of
I guess bone density, I guess insulin resistance, prostate, benign hyperplasia. There's a lot of things when we look at sort of metabolic syndrome as well being caused by low estrogen as well as low testosterone. So it is an important one that you can cause issues when it's too high, you can cause issues when it's too low.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well said. This is another rabbit hole. Stop
Ah,
using T4 and T3 in combination. You did that in end of March. I remember, but the thing is, it's like, let's say, okay, you're talking about high dose. Obviously, that's a combination for danger. But
yeah.
let's say if I say low dose T4, like 50 microgram on someone and like 1.5 gram week, 10 units GH 2-3 times a day, spread out, 3 CBOT twice a week, that kind of anti-catabolic state. And then T4 at 50 microgram, and then T3, but T3 just twice a week at 12.5. What I mean by that is you don't use thyroid function in terms of optimizing metabolic, but just in terms of immunomodulation, just in terms of not going under, but just kind of in a linear fashion that's not destructive, that's not optimizing. You want to create your own sweat. You want to create your own metabolic activation with willpower, stamina, sweat, cocktail, sprint, hit training, explosive training, jumping, plyometric, whatsoever. But in some ways, if let's say low dose T4 to T3 ratio, where T3 will be twice a week, there was something you will agree on or you will go against. Because the thing is, the way I see it is in terms of gut microbiota, the gut in terms where the thyroid function is mostly produced, the TSH, it seems that if you think more of functional medicine than at the receptor level of the neurochemistry, it kind of makes sense from a functional medicine practice. So I was curious about your answer.
Yeah, that's why I made that post. So obviously my background is conventional drug design, but when I moved away, it was all into functional medicine, and that's what I've tried to bring to bodybuilding is, of course, see that these medications have use, but then ask the functional questions why. And I guess that post was sort of towards, someone on prep and a coach is telling them 200 micrograms of T4 and 25 micrograms of T3 or 50 micrograms of T3. And it's sort of what's the purpose of the T4 in that equation? Because it's doing nothing other than increasing the T4 pool, which then increases your thyroid hormone binding globulin, but actually then robs you of your free T3. So it makes no sense.
So
And
I want to ask you from me, because I'm using right now 100 micrograms T4, 25 micrograms T3. And right now I'm having issues with going hypoglycemic, even on high carb days, 600 gram carb. I'll eat 100 or 120 gram carb, and 90 minutes, 2 hours later, I'm like having to rush to my next meal because I'm dropping blood sugar to 3.0. What should I do? Should I just stop the T4 at this point, or should I stop the T3 at this point? Because I'm already relatively contest shape, right? So from here, I want
yeah,
to obviously, hold my mass and hold my condition for 2 weeks without going catabolic, without going hypoglycemic all the time, because it's getting hard to even like do anything, if I leave my house and I have to rush back to go eat a meal, right?
and I was sort of like part of that post was the half-life of T4 is about 5 days. So when you take 100 micrograms, if the half-life is 5 days, it's just building and building and building in your system. As a monotherapy, okay, that's fine. You're just building up someone's total T4 pool if they're hypothyroid and coming at the angle of, oh, well, the body's intelligent. It's going to do the conversion of T4 to T3, whether that's in the liver, whether that's acetylation in the gut, whether it's inside the cells to bring the T3 into the nucleus. But when you are combining T4 and T3 chronically, you're driving that T4 level up over time. You're also putting in active thyroid hormone. So the LT3, the synthetic T3's half-life is about 24 hours. But and this is a big but, has actually two half-lives. So you actually get a biphasic metabolism of T3 when you take it. And for some people, that can cause hyperthyroid problems when that dose has its first elimination. And if that hyperthyroid symptom is hitting you, it's going to drive your blood sugar down because your metabolic rate increases. So glycolysis and everything else increases. And so your blood sugar is having to then try and stabilize that. And then post-stabilization, you get that drop. What is the T4 doing in the background to that? I wouldn't say too much other than driving your T4 pool up. If you got bloods done, you'd be looking at sort of both sides because most people just focus on free T4, free T3, and TSH. You should also look probably at the total T4, the total T3, and the actual TBG, the thyroid binding globulin, to give you a bigger picture of what's going on. The active, if I was to pick one to drop out, in your instance, it's very hard to say because you're probably being caught by the hyperthyroid symptom of the T3. If you take out that T3, it would depend then on where your TSH is now currently. But, and it's a big but, because you're taking T4, your T4 pool is going to be in a position where you're going to have adequate thyroid hormone for conversion. So it won't really matter where your TSH value is because you're not reliant on the thyroid making T4. But the other side of it then is making sure that the conversion process of that T4 is as pristine as possible. So between your selenoproteins, the deiodinase enzymes that take away the iodine from T4 to make T3, they would all have to be in an optimal position to help utilize that T4 towards free T3. So it's more than likely what I'd probably say is your T3 is creating a hyperthyroid scenario because of how it eliminates from the body. It'd be very interestingly timed where exactly you're going hyperthyroid or you're going hypo, because that first elimination I think is about the 7 or 8 hour mark from what I remember from the graph. So if you're taking your thyroid hormone in the morning and let's say 8 or 9 hours into the day when you're taking a hypo, it could be that T3 converting, that hyperthyroid symptom occurring.
Yeah, it's about 6 to 7 hours. I take it at 6 a.m. By the time noon hits, that's when I'm going hypoglycemic.
Yeah, so it's more like it'd be interesting if you done an experiment where you dropped out the T3's half-life is 24 hours. So within 3 or 4 days, it's pretty much cleared from your system. But because of, I guess, you take 25 micrograms per day, the next day there's only 12.5 micrograms in your system. I'd probably skip 2 or 3 days of T3 and see, do you get that hypo symptom? Because it could be that drug elimination that's causing it.
So 25 maybe every 3 days instead of every day.
You could try that.
Yeah.
I mean, like what Benoit said, my angle was coming from like when you're taking really high doses of T4 alongside high doses of T3 or even stable 25 micrograms of T3. The T4 is just building up this T4 pool in the background that if the T3 was to fail, you have enough T4 ready to come in and do its job of getting converted. But the T3 is what's driving the sort of metabolic efficiency. So if you had to pick one or the other, to me, using T3 as a monotherapy makes more sense because with T4, every person's sort of genetic capability between their gut microbiome, their liver, selenoproteins, deiodinization, it all varies. So when you give someone 100 micrograms of T4, you're really, I guess, banking on it converting to 25 micrograms of T3 or making up some of the deficit of 25 micrograms T3 you make per day.
I'm starting to understand your thought pattern here, Dr. Dean. It makes a lot of sense. You really like to pick the monotherapy drug that's going to be as precise as possible with eliminating the ones that could have variabilities in them. So I think, yeah, this is amazing. This is great. Very, very cool. Okay. I wanted to kind of talk about nootropics a little bit. I know you're a fan of nootropics. Would you like to speak about maybe what's your favorite nootropic and why? And we can go from there.
I cycle through X, Y, and Z. So I guess the one I stood the test of time for me is probably alpha GPC and huperzine together in terms of like raising choline. It could be something as simple as high dose tyrosine for dopamine or for your thyroid. Um, I like Nupept or sometimes intranasal Anamax. It depends really on what I have for that day and where I sort of want to put my sort of brain chemistry. Um, Recently I trialed dihexa, which is very interesting, and then the sort of far out there, which I
You heard
really
about tesofensin?
which one?
Tesofensin.
I'm not too sure.
Sure, look it up. It's very trendy now. It's an upcoming nootropic. It's very strong, very, very strong. I will not use tensulfenzyme on a big cycle. Like you use it maybe off cycle, because that brings all complete neurotransmitter. You have to use
Yeah,
very, very low dose. It's used on the with Alzheimer and what happened is like they realized that it was the people that were so focused that they stopped eating. So they use it as a weight loss drugs, but then they realized that it was almost excessive neurotransmitter. So they say we'll do very low dosage and then do an increment 250 grams daily for about 5 weeks, and then they'll build up and then you stop. And then it has like neurocognitive benefit to it.
I must have a
And so
look.
I'll send it to you. I'll send it to you.
Yeah, yeah, do. I'd love to read about it. I guess nootropics have become very popular. Um, but like Benoit said, you are playing with your brain chemistry as well. So you just the same way as I'm on about like androgens messing with your dopamine transmission. You'd be a fool to think that nootropics aren't causing, I'm not going to say some level of dependence or some sort of change in brain chemistry, provided they're used sporadically. Like, I guess the easiest example is if you take modafinil every single day, when you
Mhm.
stop taking it, you end up with pretty much like a severe headache, which is from choline deficiency as well as a few other things. And that's completely oversought by people who take modafinil every single day as this sort of limitless creativity stimulating drug that's easy to obtain. It has side effects if it's chronically used that you have to sort of view these things with respect and use them for really focused periods where you really want to get maximum productivity or concentration. Um, I wouldn't necessarily be an advocate of like taking nootropics all the time towards like having to do work because if it's sort of you having to rely on that nootropic to stimulate your brain as opposed to your own brain's dopamine driving your ambition or want to do that work or to seek that reward, it sort of then you just fall into this lazy pattern, in my opinion, where
Mhm.
you'll rely on that not drug but that supplement in order to feel stimulated to do work.
Yeah, there can be an addictive quality to these things, right? Because you start feeling, oh, this is really working for me. And maybe there's no physical addiction, but there might be that addiction to, oh, I know I was very productive by using XYZ. And even with like an Adderall or like you said, like a modafinil, which is prescribed for lots of people these days, I always warn them that you should be very cautious of your habits when you're using these substances. And I think that was a good point that you made about using them during times of focused work to elevate your ability to build new habits or things like this. Because otherwise, what happens is you're going to have basically the same habits that you started with, but now you're reliant on something. So if you don't have it, you're going to be almost in a worse off state. Plus, then there's the side effect crash. So as far as cycling these goes, do you have like a general recommendation of, let's say I'm going to try a new nootropic, I'm going to start it tomorrow. How long should I maybe test it out before then cycling off? And then how long should I stay off before maybe trying a different one?
Very hard to say. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's not like we have like strict clinical data that I guess we have, a time period of desensitization or like caffeine, with repeated use of caffeine, the adenosine blocking or the stimulating the adrenergic response you get from caffeine gets blunted over time. And, quite surprisingly, people think you have to stay off caffeine for weeks upon weeks to get that resensitization. It happens in about 10 to 14 days of like abstinence. I guess when you look at all the different nootropics, it really depends, like we talked about in terms of that neurotransmission and the nerve thresholds. If you're creating more and more dopamine or more nerve transmission with more dopamine, you're going to push that dopaminergic threshold higher and higher and higher. That it probably does make sense to cycle off where you're not stimulating your brain to allow that nerve to come back to where it was before. Um, I guess a very simple rule to follow when you're utilizing nootropics is to stick at sort of one at a time, if possible, um, and get a feel for how each one is affecting your neurochemistry. If you are sort of taking, 4 or 5 in one go, you're sort of, if you run into a position where you have like a contraindication, where you have something go wrong, where you have either a manic episode to speak,
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't be able to say, oh, well, it was that caused the issue with my dopamine, or my serotonin went a little too high and it made me quite volatile. You're probably start with one, and if you want to have the synergy of another nootropic on top, add, one at a time. And I'd probably say three max in terms of like your sort of nootropic ingredients, all affecting different pathways as to speak. So, if you have one that's affecting acetylcholine and cholinergic transmission, you have another one that's increasing dopamine output, and then maybe, an MAO inhibitor mechanism where it's stopping the breakdown of dopamine or it's stopping the breakdown of serotonin. That would probably be something that's a little more balanced than, putting in something that boosts acetylcholine and boosts dopamine and boosts serotonin. We're just really just driving up all the neurotransmitter creation in the body
Right.
rather than looking at the other sort of mechanisms of, I'll boost this one, but I'll try and extend the amount of the others that I'm making naturally.
Cool. Now I know you have a pre-workout supplement as well, Dr. Dean. What nootropics do you have in that one? Is it just an alpha GPC huperzine combo, or is there other ones in there?
So, so with pre-focus plus, I put in sort of, I came at it from the angle of when you're looking at trying to get stimulated for training or for work. So pre-focus, it was designed for training, but it's also designed for concentrated work efforts. And similarly, like what you asked, I'd not recommend it any more than sort of 3 or 4 days per week. I would not recommend it taking every single day, and I would take breaks from it where, after 6 or 8 weeks of using it every few days, take a month off using it. And the reason for that is I went with over 2 grams of dopamine precursors. So there's tyrosine, phenylalanine, mucanopurines for standardized L-Dopa. There's alpha GPC with citicoline and huperzine in order to improve your choline transmission. So you're getting stimulated from the dopamine in order to get yourself ready to go train and to keep yourself sort of in the zone motivated for sets or for intensity. And then the codeine aspect is for concentration, for actually paying attention to muscular contraction, improved sort of, uh, muscle brain connection. And then the rest of it was lion's mane in terms of sort of BDNF expression. So again, helping your brain make stronger neural connections, and a really low dose of caffeine, 200 milligrams from pure calf and a micro encapsulated form of caffeine. And I remember when I first came out like 3 years ago, I put on the tub, you need to take this about 60 minutes before you train. Like this wasn't like a dry scoop in a car park and then you go and train. Because of how these ingredients take time to sort of be absorbed in your system, especially caffeine, it takes about 60 to 90 minutes for it to be absorbed, be digested and absorbed. Um, with the time released caffeine and the organic caffeine from green coffee extract, similarly, again, it was taking about 60 to 90 minutes for it to enter your system, and then it took effect. And most of the guys that didn't listen to the advice dry scooped it. By the time they got to the end of their training session, like an hour, 90 minutes later, they were getting more motivated and just extending their training session.
3 hour
So it
training
was,
session.
it's a sweet spot of following the sort of guidance to make sure it's hitting you at the right time. And that sort of, again, it's around like the half-life, the absorption of compounds. But I didn't want something that interfered with appetite, so that when you finish training, caffeine anhydrous is quite strong and irritating to your gut, that, yeah, you get jacked up and very stimulated very quickly. But when you stop training, you either have an energy crash or you have still quite a high adrenaline sort of cortisol response where your appetite is just non-existent.
Yeah, and you've got that vasoconstriction effect if you go over, 250 or 300 milligrams of caffeine. So that's awesome. I'm gonna order some tonight.
So is that something you would
Yeah, I have
recommend?
a question before I go. Sorry, Morgan. You want to talk, Morgan? You didn't
Oh, I was
talk.
just gonna ask him, like, is that something you would recommend, like having like with your pre-workout meal if it takes around 60 to 90 minutes to kick in, or
Yeah, so normally what I say is drink it and then have your pre-workout meal and then wait your hour, and then either if you're close to your gym, 20-minute drive, or if you got a longer drive. But yeah, I'd always drink it first and then have your pre-workout meal so it's sort of in before food goes in on top. And
would
your
you
stomach
recommend
is
that
gonna
like
be,
for any nootropic too? Because like I recently have this dihexa that I haven't tried yet, but I plan
or
on.
you're in
Yeah.
for some fun.
Yeah, I'm excited. I like this is a nootropics is like a realm I haven't really dived into personally because I'm one of those guys, even with like pre-workouts, like stimulant pre-workouts, I might use it like once or twice a month. I try to just kind of stay clear of these things. But so yeah, like something like dihexa, is that something that you would also recommend? Like take it, eat the pre-workout meal, and then expect the effects like 60 to 90 minutes later.
Yeah, I mean with dihex, I'd probably take it upon wake because it's sort of its effect is about, for me personally, when I take it, it's about 7 to 8 hours.
Okay.
It's quite prolonged. And if you take it too close to bedtime, you'll end up with some crazy dreams for how it influences your dopamine transmission. So probably take a little bit earlier in the day, knowing that'll be still sort of in your system if you're training in the afternoon time.
Is there a starting dose you recommend? And like I'm 325 pounds, like would I need to take more like to get like the effect that I'm looking for?
I can't remember the exact max dose that was trialed. I probably like what Robin asked, just start with one capsule, which I think is 10 milligrams. I think you can go up to 30 or 40. Don't quote me, I'd have to check the research.
Yeah.
Um, but 10 milligrams, especially if you've never tried anything like this before. Um, again, Dihexa was designed for Alzheimer's, probably very similarly to the drug that Bob was on about, in terms of improving neurogenesis and strengthening brain connections surrounding dopamine. So I found it very dopaminergic stimulating that you've got a task list and you're just burning through it really quickly with no distractions, not looking at your phone, not looking at social media. It's definitely something in terms of like probably an intense training day where you need full attention, like squats or deadlifts would be the perfect day to try it.
Yeah, we'll put it to the test tomorrow.
Look forward to it.
Benoit.
My question before I go. Well, thank you. It's been an honor. I'm glad we talk and exchange. I really enjoy your posts you do on Instagram. It's very well done, very elaborate, very well explained. You know, there's a really academic generosity on your behalf. There is a few cases that happened to me as a coach where I saw people with very low blood pressure, but we realized with time that it's not because they had outstanding genetic. It was actually mineral and vitamin deficiency, which misread their blood pressure. And I was curious, what was your intake? Because me, I realized it with a prognosis and conclusion. But in some ways, I didn't really fully understand the mechanic of how, why, and it's very convoluted. That's why I'm asking the question because I really don't know. I really don't know.
Yeah, but high blood pressure is the easy one always to solve. Low blood pressure, me speaking personally, my blood pressure, you probably see it on my story. I think it was last Friday, I took it at 5:30 and I woke up and it was 95/65, which is quite low. And then if in the past I've been on prep and one day it was actually at 80/60. Um, when your blood pressure is that low, your body basically feels like lead. Like you literally cannot walk properly. Your body just all you can do is just lie down because any movement, your body feels so heavy and concrete. When it comes to increasing blood pressure, you sort of have to go the opposite of what you'd do with high blood pressure, and that you have to add in a lot of sodium and try and drive up blood volume. Um, Normally for me it's like a meal with 4 or 5 grams of salt, and then repeat it 2 or 3 hours later until I can sort of start budging that systolic number up. Um, the main, I guess, risk factor with low blood pressure is lack of blood flow to your brain, cerebral blood flow. Because when you think about it, blood to your legs is fine, blood to your brain is going against gravity. So you need higher pressure to get blood up to your brain and then down to your extremities.
But what are
More
the
so,
options? Is it methylfolate?
so salt would be one, sodium would be definitely one, calcium and magnesium would be the other two that I'd put a big focus on. Um, Especially calcium, knowing that calcium is going to be important for muscular contraction, which again is going to help with arterial blood flow. You sort of want to implement stuff that you know is vasoconstrictive. So I'm not suggesting it, but you can go slightly high dose caffeine in order to try and drive a vasoconstrictive response. But there's nothing really, I guess, supplementally that we know will increase blood pressure.
How about
In
higher level, like ferritin, maybe in heavier ferritin concentration?
having higher iron might help in terms of more oxygen delivery. Maybe you could look at like periwinkle extract has vinpocetine, and obviously vinpocetine helps with oxygenation up to the brain, cerebral blood flow. Because the worst thing, like I said, when you have low blood pressure is trying to move, trying to get your body to move. I don't necessarily think it's going to be any sort of metal deficiency, like metal folate, metal B12, homocysteine recycling. Um, unless, again, genetically, they're creating a lot of nitric oxide, so endothelial nitric oxide, where their blood vessels have just expanded too much. And so the system has basically become very efficient. Um, and you're sort of trying to do the opposite and make it less efficient or increase blood flow to constrict the artery. It's it's a difficult one. Any of the times where it's hit me, higher salt like really like going to town with sodium. Not as much fluid, so you're trying to retain that sodium in your bloodstream, which again, you're sort of doing unhealthy things to try and correct something that is what you probably consider quite healthy if your blood pressure is low. The other thing that I found that worked quite well was very heavy compression socks. So you're then not having to worry about too much about the sort of venous return of blood from the ankles up to the sort of upper thigh. So getting really strong full leg compression socks will take some of the effort away of having to try and pump that blood out from the legs.
Maybe
There's no
increasing dietary fats so that your blood sugar doesn't drop and then dump more electrolytes out from your kidneys. Do you think that could be?
Yeah, you could try that. That's definitely another good suggestion. It's it's one that I've spent hours reading into to try and personally alleviate it when it hits me bad. But the only thing is, literally, it's just normally it hits you and you're left with no choice but to rest or just sit around until things pick up again. I guess when you have such low blood pressure, you're at low cardiovascular and renal disease risk, but you're at higher risk of having, a head injury or a fall because you can have periods where not enough blood goes to your brain or your eyesight and you black out. So, there's it like everything that we've talked about. It's like sort of like a fine balance where you don't want to be too high or too low. You want to sit sort of maybe in that 110 to 120 systolic.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Dean, I don't want to keep you any longer because this has been such an amazing podcast. I know it's getting late for you. Is there anything else that you guys want to talk about real quick, or just what I wanted to say is I'm on the SN Education website right now, ordering me some pre-pump. It says there's 2 flavors, so I wanted to ask you one last question. What's your favorite flavor of pre-pump?
Sour Stardust. Alien juice. We just tongue in cheek that it's like a lemon lime Mountain Dew, but with some of the nootropics that's in it, it can be a little bit on the bitter side. Sour Stardust is really like sherbet or sherbet. That's sort of like fizzy candy. So it's a really nice flavor. I really like it over the alien juice.
Yeah, well, they both sound amazing. So, Dr. Dean, is there anywhere else that people can find you or get a hold of you if they want to learn more about your coaching, your services, your products?
Yeah. My Instagram's probably the best place that Benoit showcased Dean STM. I have a YouTube, but I rarely post on it. That PCT video from my earlier years, it's probably about 8 or 9 years old, that video now.
Masterpiece.
Um,
Must listen.
yeah,
Must listen.
Dean STM is my
It's a,
YouTube, but
it's a position of
um,
the breakthrough. It's a position of the
it,
breakthrough. It was.
and then we've got SN Education, the education website, where I've got like lectures on PDs, physiology lectures. I have a full team of educators there between like osteopath, physiotherapists, a medical doctor, a female educator. We basically just put out content like what's on social media to try and make the industry a more educated place, to put it that way.
Yeah.
And then, like you see there, we've got the Supplement Needs website, supplementneeds.co.uk.
So in blood chemistry, remember the ratio. Remember the ratio. Look at the ratio. Be a detective of your ratio. That's what we learned today.
Wow.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I'm a big fan of, blood work, like you showed there. You have to take a functional approach. That's why I sort of fell in love with functional medicine of, the whole go back to the start, PCT, conventional medicine basically just fobs it off or says it's your own fault, let the drugs clear, see what happens. Sometimes, oh, you have a fertility problem, here's Clomid without actually understanding what Clomid's doing. If you put your mind to it and you ask why is this problem happening? You want to get to the root cause of the problem. And I love books like what you showed there, where it actually teaches you functional ranges for problems as opposed to this is by the book. This is what you need to follow.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. There's so much insight in this podcast. Thank you so much, Dr. Dean, Benoit, and Big Mo.
Pleasure.
For all the listeners, if you have questions for Dr. Dean, please leave them in the comments below. We're going to have to bring you on again in the future. And make sure, of course, again, you guys check out his Instagram, which I'll put below as well, and your website. I'll put the links, everything down in the description below. Thank you guys so much for listening. Please make sure you subscribe. We'll see you guys in the next episode. Have a great night, guys. Thank you so much.